those joining. There'll be just a few moments just while everybody connects and gets their Zooms to work. But we won't take too long before we get cracking, because we've got about an hour today. So we want to make the best use of our time, but more importantly, your time as well. So what I will do, though, is I'll tell you what, I'll do the housekeeping notes just so that we get that bit over and done with. Just to say that this session is being recorded, so it will go on the PRCA's YouTube channel at some point in the not too distant future. So you can all relive the experience again. But arguably even more important than that is that there is a sale on, a 20% sale, 20% discount on training that the PRCA issues every January. I have a vested interest in encouraging as many people to do PRCA training as possible, because I run the Diploma in Public Affairs Management. And indeed, actually, one of the podcasts that, as part of the course materials that you get access to, was recorded with Iain here, who's on today's webinar. So go on to the PRCA website, book your training, put Jan Sale 24 in the checkout, and you'll get a 20% discount. So that's the cheap, a bit over and done with the session. We're going to crack on. Look, we've got an hour roughly to look at politics in 2024, a year like no other. Not least, there are a whole bunch of elections taking place, various estimates, 70 countries, 2 billion people, national elections taking place. Not least, of course, here in the UK, where election fever is already taking over. Maybe not so much for the general public, but certainly for public affairs types like ourselves, we couldn't be any more excited, could we? I can see everybody's very excited faces and those on the call as well. So we're going to look at some trends. We'll look at indicators, what we as public affairs professionals can expect from the course of the next year. And we've got a fantastic panel here today. I'm going to shut up generally because I'm just here as the sort of the host and moderator. What I would encourage everybody to do is to submit questions. We'll have some time at the end. We'll try and leave some time at the end for questions. But honestly, if you've got any queries, put them into the chat or the Q&A. I think I can access both, and I'll ask the panel those questions as we go through, if they sort of fit. If not, we can save them until the end. But look, we want to make this as participatory-ish, that's not a word, as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to just quickly introduce everybody, but I'll let them speak for themselves rather than me doing it. That would be rather rude of me. So I'm Stuart Thomson. I'm the founder of CWE Communications. So I'm the moderator today, but we've got Emily Fermor, partner at Hanbury Strategy, Christine Quigley, Deputy Head of Public Affairs at Grayling. We've got Iain Anderson, founder and Executive Chairman at H Advisors Cicero, and Tara Singh, who's the Managing Director of Public Affairs at Hill and Knowlton. So what I'll do, I'll just run down the list. I'll get them to speak, and then we'll crack on with some questions. Emily, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Thanks, Stuart, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. So as Stuart said, I'm Emily. I'm a partner at Hanbury Strategy. We're a strategic advisory firm founded 7 years ago and now employing 120 people in London and Brussels. I'm also the Vice Chair of the PRCA Public Affairs Board Executive Committee. And relevant to this discussion, I've worked on all three of the last 3 general elections. Not had a huge amount of success though, because I have worked for the Liberal Democrats. So I worked for Jo Swinson in the last campaign. I was a candidate in 2017, and then in 2015, which was my first bit out of university, I was a campaign organiser. I was also a councillor for 5 years, where I won my ward by 1 vote. So I have had some electoral success over the years.
Well, that's very impressive. That's a good track record, regardless of all the outcomes there. Christine.
Hi everyone, my name is Christine. I am the Deputy Head of Public Affairs at Grayling UK, part of our integrated corporate affairs practice. Over the last 16, 17 years, I've worked in a variety of roles, the mix of agency, in-house in the transport sector. I started off in the charity sector, and probably most germane to this discussion, I'm a former Labour political advisor and also a London Assembly candidate a long time ago.
Very good. Iain.
Great to be with everyone and the group today. Happy New Year, if I can still say that as well. The Scots amongst us like to say that for as long as we possibly can, Stuart. I am founding director and chair of H advisors Cicero. For most of our life, we're an independent business, but we became part of Havas and ultimately Vivendi just 2-3 years ago now, and we're part of that international group. My background is politics and journalism. So I was a business journalist for many years, worked around politics, worked with Ken Clarke on his leadership campaigns, but I found myself in an interesting position, I suppose, at this particular moment here in the UK, in that I'm supporting Keir Starmer for a change in government right now. Beyond the world of public affairs, I'm a non-executive of the fintech body Innovate Finance, and I sit on the court of Britain's leading university, the University of St Andrews.
I went to Aberdeen. I'll let you away with that though, Iain. And last but not least, Tara.
Hi everyone, lovely to speak to you today. I'm Tara Singh. I've recently joined Hill & Knowlton to head up their public affairs offering. Hill & Knowlton, I think what makes it special is it's a global company. We've got 70 offices in 30 countries, but we've also got a sector model. So all our public affairs people sit in integrated sector teams where they sit alongside colleagues in PR, social media, advertising, all that good stuff, with an expertise in either energy or tech or financial services or health. So we kind of like to see ourselves as like the policy experts who have that integrated campaigning approach as well. And my background is I very much kind of heavy on both the policy and the political side. I joined H&K from Shell, where I led their policy and advocacy for their global renewables business. And before that, I was at a startup called First Utility. Before that, I was involved with the disastrous London Mayoral campaign of 2016. And before that, I was a special advisor for David Cameron in the number 10 policy unit.
Thank you very much. So look, I'm glad we're all using this in a cathartic way as well. Let's get cracking. So if Rishi Sunak, if his working assumption that he's looking at the sort of the second half of the year for the general elections, how do you think public affairs professionals should be preparing in this first 6 months? And I'll start with Emily and I'll work down, but I'll vary this as we go through. Emily, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so I think the worst thing to do would be to just wait and see what happens. I think there's sometimes a bit of a kind of maybe a sense of inevitability of a new government, that there's a tendency therefore to take a step back, wait and see what happens towards the end of the year. Actually, I think if you have a pertinent and urgent issue that you want to make progress on, you can do so in the next 6 months. And actually, the next 6 months is crucial for that. So, for example, number 10 have a focused delivery unit concerned with making progress and demonstrating progress to the electorate in the next few months. And so showing to government and articulating to government what you can achieve, how you can achieve it, and so they can so you can work with them collaboratively, I think you can make a huge amount of progress.
Brilliant, thank you. Christine, what would be your way of preparing and using this 6 months?
Absolutely. I think there are 3 things that all of us should be thinking about as public affairs professionals. And the first one is that, on the basis that the working assumption, which is very strange language, by the way, given that, the Prime Minister is the one who really decides what the election is called, but, that's another issue. If the working assumption is that we aren't going to go to the polls till October, November, we are still going to have a number of months of parliamentary time. So, we did have a King's speech at the end of last year. There are pieces of legislation going through. So, as Emily says, it's really important not to just assume that there will be a Labour government. There is still a Conservative government that wants to be engaged with. I think now is a really good time to start bedding in with prospective parliamentary candidates, particularly in seats where your organisation has a close relationship. We are starting to see them now being selected in most of those target seats, particularly for Labour and also for the Lib Dems. But it's really important when you are engaging with them to be as helpful as possible and to be a little bit selective about how they're engaging. A lot of these PPCs are still trying to manage full-time jobs with campaigning. I spoke to a PPC at Labour Party conference last year who I think had 150 different invites to come to events and meetings, and they just can't manage it. So do think about building those relationships, but think about how you are helping those people and how you can actually have a useful conversation. And the third thing that I'd recommend is to take this time to really think through the various scenarios and the positioning. Again, there seems to be this kind of assumption that we are going to have a Labour majority government. We all know, a week is a long time in politics and 11 months is significantly longer than that. So really think through what potentially a minority government might look like, engaging with some of the smaller parties, particularly the Lib Dems and the SNP. It's not necessarily cut and dried, and it's really worth taking the time to think through what some of the most likely scenarios might mean for your organisation.
Brilliant, thank you. Iain, what would you add to that as well?
So I would say expect the unexpected. Don't work on the assumption. As colleagues have already pointed out, it's the Prime Minister's prerogative this at any moment. And certainly, when you talk to the opposition parties right now, they're not taking anything for granted now this year in terms of the timing of this election. It could be very, very, very attractive for Rishi Sunak personally to still go in May, not to go through those local elections on their own, not to go through a cycle that might be difficult for the Conservative Party, and certainly looking at the Prime Minister in the House before Christmas. He didn't look like he was enjoying one moment of being Prime Minister at all. Now, look, the old adage is true. When you've got the levers of power, do you necessarily want to give away the red box and the ministerial car when you can actually do something? So, look, yeah. I mean, I still think when all is said and done, I'm going for November the 14th, just to sort of add into the mix. I'm going to stick with it. I think it's probably going to be towards the back end of the year. Although I know we're going to talk about the international situation and whether or not you want to let the US cycle impact the UK cycle is another question for Downing Street to factor in. But it's entirely the Prime Minister's prerogative. If that's right, and back to your original question, that means we're going to have another party conference season. That means we're going to go through that whole activity where people thought they were showcasing their positioning in the autumn of 2023. Well, they're probably, if this working assumption is right, going to have to do that all over again in this party conference season. My bet is the manifestos absolutely go up to the wire. Why? Because the manifestos always go up to the wire in terms of preparation and creation. So don't just think that Labour's National Policy Forum, what the other parties are up to, that's all done and dusted. Far from it, because we're very much in a dynamic situation. So there's I think the ability to influence policy and manifesto thinking right up to the end. And the final thing I think is this, that and this does make me kind of hopeful. I think everybody on this call works with organizations, and the one thing I'm seeing is rather hopefully, having seen several cycles where sometimes it's very attractive for organizations to down tools and say, well, come back and talk to us after the short campaign and the election has taken place and we know who's in power. I think I'm seeing, and maybe this is more about the sophistication now of the public affairs sector, that businesses, organizations just do want to remain more engaged all the way through the process themselves, rather than just come back and talk to us when the voters have voted. So that is good, and hopefully it's a good sign in terms of the professionalism of the sector too.
It's a nice upbeat view. Plenty of time before November to still influence the manifestos. Tara, what are your thoughts on that?
I would start by saying I really agree with Iain. So I noticed in the press conference, Rishi Sunak said working assumption. Every time he was asked, he specifically said working assumption, wasn't just once. And there's a great adage in politics is whenever a politician says, I do not recall, it means they've done it, but they can't admit it. And they don't want to lie about not admitting it. So they use that very strange wording. And I thought that suggests to me they're definitely keeping on the table in early elections. So watch it. A few thoughts from me. Number one, if an election is called at short notice, get to know your wash-up procedure. So that is when bills are expedited through both Houses of Parliament, sometimes in a matter of hours or days, in order to make sure they don't fall on a general election, which would otherwise be the case. Typically, really controversial bits are stripped out of bills in order to make that happen. If you don't like something in a bill right now, be getting on to Labour in particular and say, during wash-up, get this out. If there's something you really want to make sure is kept in a bill, you're going to be potentially a bit of a risk if it's controversial, it will be taken out. So just be careful of that wash-up process. The good news is there has never not been a wash-up for the past 100 years. So most priority legislation should get through, but maybe with a few bits taken out. The second thing is discipline is the watchword. What that means is the Labour will want to say as little as possible on policy because they're massively ahead in the polls. And anything they say, the Tories will end up costing and saying it's a tax bombshell. We already know with net zero, it's becoming a very difficult area for Keir Starmer precisely because that's the technique the Tories are doing. The Conservatives will also want to have discipline. But in my view, as they get more desperate, random announcements might come out in order to try and shore up cool vote. So I think I'd watch that space. I'd also say that government typically grinds to a halt. There will be a real desire, because it's discipline, for the Conservatives to not be announcing anything which is not seen as a core priority for their target voters. So if you've got some complicated regulatory policy that you need the government to sign off on, it's going to get jammed up in number 10, unless you make it an issue publicly that it's jammed up and they're getting a few bad headlines and someone number 10 says, for God's sake, just get out the fishing boat barnacle consultation. I'm sick of this press. So be prepared to be as aggressive as necessary in the media to get your issue back on the agenda, because otherwise it just won't.
Brilliant, thank you, Tara. We've already had a question in, which we were going to come on to the sort of some of the more international elements, but I'll raise it now as it's come in, and Iain mentioned it quite rightly as well. Is about the implications for other elections taking place around the world, not least in the US. And whether we think the timing of well, obviously we know when the US election will be, but the timing of the US election will impact on what we do here in the UK. I'll let Iain go first because he mentioned it first, but I'll come around to others if they want to say something on that as well.
Look, I'm thrilled the way this conversation was set up, Stuart, that someone's asked this as the first question. I think, as we were thinking about this conversation today, I think hopefully everybody else on the group is as well too, because yeah, look, I mean, there's a festival of democracy going on this year. Russia is even voting this year. Not necessarily that's going to be a festival of democratic endeavor, but it's going to come out with an outcome. I think it's called Vladimir Putin being re-elected. But two things to that very specific question. This is the first time in my living memory where the US cycle and certainly my working life, and the UK cycle have locked together. Yeah, I mean, there may be people who are older and wiser on this call that can disabuse me of that idea, but it's you need to be doing this a very, very, very long time for those two impacts to lock together. And yes, I do think one is going to wash over the other. I think the impact of the culture war is going to be felt here. We see it with Farage, we see it with elements of the Conservative Party, and it's a core part of the Trump offer as well. So that is going to play across the piece. The debate around tax in the States will play into what's taking place here. The debate around the Inflation Reduction Act and the fiscal stimulus from Biden sees an echo in the Labour plan currently here in the UK. So I think a tremendous amount of crossover. Final thing for me on this, and I think this zooms out not just from the US, but we're having this conversation in advance of the Davos meet next week, and I think the headline about what WEF is talking about next week is the impact of AI and deep fake activity in the US election and other elections. So at a policy level, there is going to be, I think the US cycle will have a big impact on the UK cycle and what we're all watching and thinking about, and voters are thinking about, and what socialists firing up and how parties are campaigning, but also the impact aspects of the ability to, frankly, have, deeply corrupted digital impacts on our campaigning as well. And we all need to be alert to that.
No, thanks, Iain. I think the you're entirely right, and I think the PRCA are also planning another webinar at some point on that disinformation issue. So again, if that's an area of particular interest, which I think it should be to all of us, keep an eye on the PRCA website, and that will no doubt be released very soon. Others will come in, I'm sure, but Christine in particular, I know that I think there's an Irish election.
Yeah, I
as well.
mean, look, as an Irish person who's lived in Britain for 20 years, I will crowbar conversations about Ireland and whenever possible. But I think it's really relevant. If Iain's right and we've got a UK election in mid-November, it's quite likely we may well see the UK, the US, and the Irish elections all within a fortnight of each other. So Ireland has to go to the polls by March next year. But it's likely now to be kind of pre-Christmas. And I think that the results of the Irish elections are really important for a number of reasons, partly because obviously as the country with the biggest land border with the UK, we have a really important relationship between the two countries. Ireland is actually the UK's fourth biggest trading market, even post-Brexit. So in terms of kind of trade relationships, that will be really critical. And the Irish government is actually taking the British government through the European Court of Human Rights at the moment over legislation that was passed in Westminster, so the Northern Ireland Legacy and Reconciliation Bill. So that relationship is really critical. What we're seeing in Ireland at the moment is Sinn Féin have been ahead of the polls consistently. They're at about 30%, but we've got a kind of an anti-Sinn Féin coalition, which is also kind of surging the polls between Fine Gael at about 20% and Fianna Fáil at about 17%. So given that Ireland is very used to coalition government, it hasn't had a majority government since 1984. There are going to be some real implications depending on whether Ireland goes down the slightly kind of left-wing populist route with the Sinn Féin government, which again will have implications for how Sinn Féin does in Northern Ireland Assembly elections and in Westminster elections, or whether we see a kind of a centrist coalition, a grand coalition like we have over the last few years. So definitely one to watch.
Thank you. Emily, Tara, any on our world tour of elections, any others to mention, or stick with those two?
I was just going to say, I think I remember very vividly when Obama said the UK would be back of the queue in a trade deal after Brexit, and I think that was one of those comments which I think Number 10 thought would be helpful, but ended up setting a real narrative and agenda. And I think my assumption is the risk is that with Trump being such a wild card, all the random comments he says is going to end up dragging our politicians into debating those comments and whether they work with Trump. And there is no right answer to that. And I think particularly with the Conservatives, they'll be quite worried about that. Farage and the Reform Party, which are polling on 10%, that could deny Conservatives and Labour, respectively, seats they hope to win if it's targeted in certain areas, even if Reform doesn't win any themselves. Could we see Farage wheeling out Trump? I mean, it's hard to know, but I don't think it's going to be great for our political debate. And likewise, the June elections in Europe, I think there's a real resurgence of right-wing parties. What might that mean for the kind of issues that end up getting debated, particularly, I think, immigration?
Yeah, I think Tara's absolutely right. I would just build on that and say that we have the European elections over the summer, then the American elections. If we see a shift to the right in both of those, I think we should expect a increase in right-leaning narrative in the UK. And we've already seen, and we can come onto this later when we canter through the kind of third parties in the UK. Reform, I think at some points have been polling as the third most popular party in the UK. That will have big impacts on how the Conservatives try to respond and how they change their messaging to try and prevent losing ground to Reform. So I think a big thing to look out for is a shift to the right in European elections. If we see a kind of Trump presidency, or that seeming to be the most likely option, that I think will have a big impact on some of the big issues and messaging around the UK election campaign.
Thank you. Yeah, no, some great points there as well. And I think for me personally, one of the potential issues of all these elections sort of coming hot on the heels of each other is, Iain mentioned some of the woke council culture, etc., sort of issues. there's a chance, I think a strong chance, that they get amplified in all these various elections. So actually it becomes a sort of reputation election where you get mentioned in one election and then you get blowback in another election, and suddenly you're thinking about, as an organization, whether you're domestic or global, you're thinking about your reputation in all these various ways. So again, back to the first question about what do you do in these 6 months, that'd be, for me, part of that would be preparing for just making sure our reputations are in place and we have ways of responding. But as you know, Emily said, we're going to move on to some of the parties themselves in the UK. I think it's a good opportunity to do that. And just to explain to the audience, rather than everybody answering all of the questions on all the parties, we've sort of pre-selected members of the panel here to sort of take responsibilities for certain areas. So we're going to look at what we think is what we can expect from each party in the run-up to the general election. And we're going to start with Labour and with Christine, looking at Labour. So look, we've got some Labour policies, some just yesterday with the Child Health Action Plan as well. What do you think will be the narrative, or what can we look forward to as a narrative to hold some of these policies together? Because the party does have policies, but maybe they're not coming through particularly well at the moment. What do you think, Christine?
Absolutely. I mean, Labour's got 82 pages of policies, and frankly, nobody is going to read that. I would be surprised if everyone on this call has kind of sat down and read all of them. And the challenge is going to be how that's communicated. So over the last few months, all of Starmer's communications have been about his 5 missions. Again, we should probably offer like a spot prize to the first person who can actually remember what the 5 missions are and put them in the chat, partly because they're not necessarily the most engaging. They're a really good way of structuring what Labour wants to talk about. So getting Britain building, getting GB Energy on track, getting the NHS back on its feet. But they're not terribly specific. And if you take a look at kind of Labour's 5 missions here, compared to the pledge card in 1997, which everyone still talks about as kind of a great campaign tactic, the value of that 1997 pledge card was it was really, really specific about what it was going to do. So it was going to cut class sizes to 30. It was going to save £100 million in the NHS and treat 100,000 patients. It was going to bring in a windfall levy to get 250,000 under 25s into work. That's the kind of retail policy that, you know, it's doorstep policy. And that's something that I think Labour is going to be really working on. So we're already starting to see the party looking at some of those specifics a bit more. You mentioned the Child Health Action Plan. Something that a lot of Labour MPs have really been pushing this week is its pledge on dentistry, for example, which may not feel like the sexiest topic, but people around the country know how difficult it is to get to see an NHS dentist. And Labour's pledge is to get an extra 700,000 NHS dentistry appointments every year. So we're starting to see some of those policies being brought to life. But in terms of that overall narrative and getting people excited about the prospect of a Labour government, I think we may well see a return to a theme that Keir kind of really developed in his conference speech last year, but hasn't really focused on in the last few months, which is this idea of kind of people in Britain feeling like they're in survival mode. So the cost of living crisis has kind of taken all the fun out of life. People are, you know, they're doing what they can to survive rather than being able to think about taking their kids on holiday or going out to a restaurant every so often. And something around that kind of aspiration, I think, is something that we're going to see a lot more of from Labour. The party has to give people a vision and a reason to vote for them, not just to not vote for the Conservatives.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christine. Tara, look, the Conservatives obviously have a challenge, 13 years in power. We've had several prime ministers in that time. How do they go about building a manifesto this time? And a bit about process, but more on the sort of the, you know, what does that offer look like, do you think?
I mean, there's a word I could use beginning with S, but if it's going to be on YouTube, I probably will avoid saying it. Look, no, I think in all seriousness, the Conservatives, unlike Labour, have a very centralised manifesto process. So I think Labour ends up being centralised. I always think the leader's office ultimately decides everything, but there is a grassroots process for different bits of the Labour movement feeding in. The Conservatives is always very elitist. So normally John Penrose MP is going to be helping with some manifesto coordination, but really it would just be written by a small group in the number 10 policy unit. The strong pressure from the campaigning team will be to say as little as possible, to have very broad, nice sounding themes with a few commitments, which are usually based on stuff which would already happen. Money they've already committed to, nothing new whatsoever that could be costed by Labour. And then the real campaign will be attack campaign against Labour on immigration and tax and net zero as a proxy for spending. So I think a really great website I recommend you guys look at is called, I think, electionleaflets.org. Members of the public upload any election leaflets they get through their door. It's a really nice regional spread because it will show you that whatever the parties are telling us, the kind of geeky public read the manifestos they're campaigning on, you can see for yourself that really they'll be talking about other things, I think.
Yeah, I had an election through my door recently from the Conservative around here. No mention of the word Conservative, I think, on the leaflet. And talking of election leaflets, that brings us really nicely onto the Lib Dems and bar charts, obviously, but not just the Lib Dems. I mean, we've got a number of, I say smaller parties. I mean smaller parties in a UK setting, not in a sort of Welsh or Scottish setting, I hasten to add. But any thoughts on particularly the Lib Dems, but the SNP, Plaid and others?
Yeah, so I do a quick kind of canter through. So I've already touched on reform, which I think are likely to be a very significant fixture of our discussions over the next few months in England, in particular. But also in England, we have the Liberal Democrats. So they are expectantly targeting that sort of bridge of seats from the southwest of London through to the southwest. They think a very good night would be around 26 gains. I think even that is difficult. I mean, look, the party leader has had a very difficult couple of weeks. The issues they will be focusing on are the kind of issues that appeal to those moderate Conservative voters. So the reliability of local services, local environment issues like rivers and sewage. And actually, I think the Conservatives will need to make a decision when we get closer to the short campaign. Who is the bigger threat? Is it reform or is it the Liberal Democrats? And how do they need to change their messaging accordingly? Green Party, they've got one seat to contest. I think it looks like that they'll likely lose that. Interestingly as well, the UK is actually the only country holding elections this year, I think, where a pro-environmental or more sort of centre-left party is likely to win. I think that will result in the Green vote being squeezed by the kind of bigger Labour Party. In Scotland, so I'm sure Iain will have views on this, but in Scotland, you've obviously got SNP and Labour complete head-to-head. They're almost neck and neck at the moment. It's been a rough few months for the SNP, but actually, given the kind of pro-independence core vote, there's almost only so low that vote can go, and equally only so high Labour's vote can get. So what we're really looking is Labour needing to convince that central belt and Glasgow to back them in order to succeed. And even after a few, I can very much see a reality of a few good weeks for the SNP, some of those rumbling on scandals maybe not materialising at the right point, and the SNP bringing that balance back to kind of maybe 40% SNP and 30% Labour. That being said, it's very exciting up north of the border because you have Scottish Greens and the Alba Party, both of which pose threats to the SNP on their independence vote. So what we could see is the SNP losing majorities where that independence vote is squeezed by Scottish Greens and Alba in other places. Understandably, and what you'd expect is that the Greens will focus on things like oil and gas. They're also exercised around gender recognition and the SNP's failure to implement that policy. And then on the other side, you have Alba, who are more socially conservative and actually have similarities with the way that reform poses a threat to the Conservatives in England. The Scottish Lib Dems, so that kind of old Charles Kennedy Highland Liberals is kind of still there and has never really gone away. So really what you're expecting is for them to kind of maintain those seats, but really not make any gains. There are some brilliant kind of future stars in the party, people like Wendy Chamberlain, who is our chief whip. She is likely to keep her seat, although it will be tight. So that's the kind of picture in Scotland and England. And then on Plaid, just as a final point, so you've got 32 seats up for grabs in Wales. They've historically kind of shifted between Conservatives, Labour and Plaid. There's been a lot of talk with a new leader in Plaid that actually they're going to have some difficult, they're probably going to have a quite more difficult time. I think they've mentioned that the boundary changes mean that their kind of 4 seats might go down to 3. And they've already signalled early on that they may need to change their policy on tax rises, not wanting to be the only option in Wales that is proposing tax increases at the general election. I think in reality, they're most likely to get squeezed, and we're more likely to see Labour picking up a bunch of seats, and the Conservatives may be near wiped out in that country.
Brilliant, thanks. That was pretty comprehensive. That's a lot of parties in one fell swoop. We just had a comment in as well with one of the people on the call mentioning a number of fake newspapers coming through, sort of pretending to be newspapers but actually political leaflets. And I think, again, just as another issue, I think we'll probably see more complaints to the Electoral Commission and other authorities on things like that, because I think people are much more aware of, what's appropriate in campaigning and not this time, probably more than ever. But Iain, look, everybody's done all the various political parties. So in terms of sort of industrial strategies, engagement with business, here's the cheap plug for your F Business book of a couple of years ago. I'm sure there's still copies available on Amazon. But you've watched this for quite a period of time between the different parties, and obviously have a role, which I know you can't talk about at the moment, with the outcome with Jonathan Reynolds and business engagement. But what's your view of the political parties in their engagement with business and those industrial strategy side of things, if we can still call them that?
Yeah, that's a really good place to start. And if I can just beg your indulgence a wee bit too, I've just got a thought or two on Scotland specifically that I'll, in response to Emily, that I'd like to make. So on industrial strategy, the reality is we're going to have one party that talks about it and wants it, and we're going to have another party that doesn't talk about it and goes about it in a completely different way. And I think that's just reflective in a way, Stuart, of in a way the Theresa May Greg Clark moment, when the Conservatives did start to talk about industrial strategy, was a bit of an aberration. There were large parts of the Conservative Party that didn't want to talk about industrial strategy, and of course, just as that initiative got underway, it ended because Boris Johnson ended it, and certainly the brief Liz Truss moment, and definitively under Sunak, the idea has been rejected. And the Conservatives' approach towards this whole piece so far, and it's going to be very interesting to see how this does get reflected, if at all, in a Conservative manifesto. It seems to have gone about this not in a national way, but around specific localities. So if you think about some of the moves that they made on steel, that's very, very specific incentives around particular companies in South Wales. The way in which the Conservatives have gone about automotive, very, very specific public cash incentives to support particular companies in the Northeast. Not a joined up strategy at the moment, just very much a kind of case by case. I could be unkind and you could say sticking plaster approach, but it's going to be kind of interesting to see whether or not they go further in a manifesto. And I think this in a way relates back to the earlier point. If I kind of remember the Conservative manifesto of 1997, the Conservatives actually said some bolder things than Labour were able to in 97 on many, many issues. Why? Because the working assumption on those opinion polls going into the 1997 election was that they were probably going to lose power. And in a way, from a government relations technique perspective, there may be things that, people want to influence Labour thinking, of course they do, but there may be things that organisations in terms of their government relations can say to the Conservatives that end up being pretty radical policies. You take what the Conservatives said on pensions reform in 97, they didn't have to do any of it because they went out of power, Peter Lilly's perspectives. But what happened is that you ended up actually with Blair and Brown implementing the Turner Commission and a very, very long-term settlement for pensions. Now, a lot of that, the instigation for a lot of that was actually in the Tory manifesto, not the Labour manifesto. So to Labour, industrial strategy absolutely core to missions and indeed to manifesto. And, you know, I think around green economy, well, I mean, they're talking about that. You know, there are questions, of course, around the fiscal piece, but is it a core part of, you know, Labour's narrative? Yes, will remain so. So the hydrogen economy, infrastructure, how we link to academia, spin-offs, startups, spin-outs from universities. Again, wearing my other hat, I see quite a bit of that at the moment, again, particularly on the green economy. No, but I think Labour make this clear, and I think Labour tried to, will inevitably try to say, well, you know, we have got a plan here, whereas the Conservatives are just doing this on a case-by-case basis. So briefly, if I can, as I say, just to back to Scotland, to Emily's point, I'm afraid I'm so committed to listening into Scotland. Emily, I've whilst I'm sitting in London at the minute, I've got my BBC iPlayer switched to BBC Scotland half the time to watch some of that output. And I spent quite a bit of time there over the festive period. I was really struck this week about how Anna Sarwar was able to use the Scottish Labour leader, was able to use a formula in a speech she made earlier this week, which I don't think Labour have been able to say for a generation. And that was this. Even if you disagree with me on independence, he said, talking to that 45% of the Scottish electorate broadly, as Emily says, that broadly backs independence, kind of come what may, vote for me to get rid of the Tories. Yeah, and I think that's that. I mean, I've not heard Scottish Labour being able to say that, as I say, for at least a generation. I think that may prove very, very attractive to a lot of central belt. And in my home neck of the woods, which is the northeast of Scotland, I actually think the Conservatives are going to do quite well, because there it's a straight fight between the SNP and the Conservative Party, and I actually think in that part of the world, the SNP, the Tartan Tory, if you're like part of the SNP, is going to get squeezed, and I think in the central belt, Labour is going to squeeze the SNP because of the narrative that it's suddenly able to use. So at the moment, I actually think Labour is going to do pretty well in Scotland.
Well, that will reassure the Labour leadership. That's good. Some questions in, so I'll break away from our pre-scribed list to ask some questions. Some very useful info has come in from one of the participants who've said they've crunched the numbers in terms of dates. So 26th of March is the final date a UK parliamentary election can be called to run on the 2nd of May alongside the local election. So gives them the election period and purdah and all those sorts of things on a 25-day timetable. But in particular, they've asked what the possibility is of a 1974 style sort of, minority government operating for a period of time, possibly then with another general election. And my own little addition to that is that there's a sort of a popular belief that if the Tories were to lose, they might go on, depending on who's left, they might go on some weird and wonderful, tangent of being a bit more sort of, hardcore free markety, a bit more, if I can paraphrase hugely, but right wing, culture wars type approach. So if we do get a sort of a 1974 style election, minority government, and maybe another election shortly afterwards, what do we think that does to the opposition? Because that's really important in terms of whoever is that minority government and how they try in whatever way they can to govern for that ill-defined period of time. Sorry, that's a really long-winded question because I butchered the question that came in and added my own thoughts on it. So whoever ends up going first probably gets let off.
I was just going to say, I think that, kind of a volcano would have to erupt in every constituency in the country for Labour not to win. Like they're 20 points ahead. I have never seen that in my political career. Let's imagine the polls are fairly wrong. Let's imagine they're unbelievably wrong. 10 points ahead is all you need to win. So I just don't think a minority government is going to happen. I think what will happen is the Conservatives will lurch to the right. The reason for that is when you lose big an election, you lose all the kind of centrist seats, and you're left with the rump of really kind of dyed-in-the-wool Conservative. They're not actually that free market, though. I think a really interesting realignment we've seen across the country is this split between socially liberal and socially conservative. And really the role of the state is just as big in that socially conservative bucket as it would be for Labour. So I don't think a massive swing back towards the kind of free marketers is necessarily that likely. Of course, the Conservatives are also a bit crazy at the moment. We've seen Liz Truss still touting herself about, so never say never. But I think my nightmare pick would be Sweller. I mean, I think Sweller, worst case, Kemi, best case, all cases quite bad.
Unless Nige rejoins, of course, then that may change your analysis. Who would like to pick up that? Yeah, Christine.
Can I sort of respectfully disagree with Tara on the polling? I mean, obviously, Labour has been ahead of the polls very consistently for the last year, but it's really worth remembering the scale of the kind of defeat in 2019. So again, if we're looking back at 1997, and the number of seats that Tony Blair needed to deliver a majority government was significantly smaller than the number of seats that Keir Starmer is going to. Starmer will have to deliver double-digit seat wins in every English region and in Scotland and Wales, which is going to be challenging. There are obviously fantastic PPCs who are working incredibly hard and have been selected relatively early. But I think Labour is certainly not being complacent, and certainly some of the conversations I had have suggested that, the potential of a 1974 style thing has been considered. And, there is some thinking about that. Now, it will really depend on the fortunes of some of the smaller parties and some of the kind of nationalist parties as well that Emily and Iain have been talking about, because I think there's a big difference between, having a working majority of 2 and then going to polls again in 6 months because, you really have to sort that, or, potentially having to do a deal with another party. So I think there's a real sense within Labour that it's important not to be complacent, and they will certainly be kind of fighting for every seat. But I think the assumption that Starmer is the next Prime Minister is not necessarily the assumption that, that there will be a majority Labour government. So it's definitely worth thinking through some of those different scenarios.
Yeah, and I think I would just build on that. I think the kind of magic number 10 that Tara referenced is the one that we need to watch. So Labour needs to be 10 points ahead to get a majority on polling day. We should expect the polls to squeeze over the next few months. They will soften. They've already almost shown indications of softening. And actually, the last time an opposition was ahead by 17 points with around a year to go before polling day was in 2009. That lead then softened down to 7.2 on the election and delivered a hung parliament. That being said, I agree. I don't think there will be a hung parliament. I think Labour will deliver a majority. But the size of that majority is important and shows that the smaller parties will have a significant role to play. So I do not think the Liberal Democrats will join in any kind of form of coalition. But if you have a Labour majority of 20 to 30, who is Keir Starmer more going to want to speak to? Is it Ed Davey, if Ed Davey's still leading the party, or is it his left flank? Is it the kind of the more left wing in his party? It's actually more likely that he has a lot of similarities and can see that there's a room forward by aligning with them on certain policies and measures. So I think a minority hung parliament is going to be a big subject of discussion over the next few months. I think the Westminster bubble will get very excited about it. I agree. I think it's a very low chance of happening. That being said, I think the smaller parties will continue to have an important role, and actually more so than they've had in the last few years.
Iain, just picking up on that, as guys have said, is there anything that can, this is in relation to a question that's come in again, is there anything that can shift those polls? Can the Tories a change of leadership, dumping Rishi. I don't know if some of the stories about around the post office or something along those sort of lines really stick to Keir Starmer, or maybe some sort of international aspect. Obviously, we had the US UK military action yesterday in Yemen, I think, if I get my international relations right. Anything you could think might actually change those polls at all, or?
So no. And why no? Because I do think we're in the and I do think you get this after 13, 14, 15 years. We're definitely in the time for a change place. The Conservatives replacing 5 leaders with 6 leaders, I think, would only help Labour in terms of its articulation to say, this total spin cycle. So no, I think it's very, very hard. And indeed, what we've seen in the last 24 hours by the intervention in Yemen is, of course, about fundamentally, Stuart, is about global supply chains, right? And actually, no one's going to be talking about global supply chains in terms of a retail policy, but Trump protectionism, the approach in the European parliamentary elections, the approach in many other global elections is essentially about protectionism or globalism washing over these conversations. No, I mean, the impact again of the last of the intervention overnight is, and you're starting to see it. If anyone kept an eye on the oil price this morning, it started to tick back up again. Now, oil price is moving up again, not good for the inflation number, and certainly not good on a day-to-day basis for average consumers, or for the purposes of this conversation, average voters. To the original question, though, I think I would guide everyone who's watching today, if you have not seen it, I think it is available now online, is James Graham's wonderful play, This House, that was at the National Theatre, that depicts the 1974-1979 Parliament. So yes, in that second election, Wilson got a very, very, very small majority, but that government continued for almost 5 years. Almost 5 years in terms of various supply and confidence arrangements that Emily was kind of pointing to in terms of what might take place. And again, from a practitioner point of view, as we saw during the coalition, the governance of the Quad back in 2010 through to 2015 actually created many more structured avenues to talk to policy and to talk about policy. So look, if we do end up, and I don't think we will, I agree with the other panelists, but if we do end up with a very small majority stroke hung situation, there's every chance that it actually may last for several years, because I think the public appetite to want to go to the polls yet again is going to be very low.
Thanks, Iain. Look, I'm conscious of time, so if you've got questions, get them in shortly. I've got quite a specific question that's come in, which I'll sort of read out from one of the audience. I'm trying to reorganize and standardize my organization's approach to political engagement. It's been a bit ad hoc in the past. They've set up a working group. Their political aims are quite wide-ranging, but they're building relationships with key departments. Does anyone on the panel have any advice for setting up a group like this and agreeing priorities? So a bit more specific day-to-day public affairs, but within that election setting. Any thoughts from anybody on that sort of working group idea and how to make them most effective? Christine, I think you You
Ah,
waved at me first.
I've been trying to and struggling to unmute.
Apologies.
I think the one thing that I would say, and it depends, I'm not sure whether this person's kind of coming from a sort of trade association industry group or from kind of an individual organization. But the really helpful thing, I think, when discussing these priorities, different people within your organization can have very different priorities. As you say, there are lots of things that are quite wide ranging. It's really focusing down on the 2 or 3 things that are going to make the most difference to your bottom line operationally. So actually really linking back in those kind of public affairs and lobbying objectives with the commercial objectives of your organization, and really looking at the areas where you may differ from other people in the market or other people in the industry. So in particular, if you are, if you're an organization rather than a trade body, look at the areas where you agree with your competitors and get the trade body to kind of go out and talk about those things, particularly kind of on the front foot, and really focus in on the areas where you've got something interesting and something different to say. I'm sure any of us on the panel would be delighted to have a further conversation about what that might look like.
We'll all have views, Christa. You're quite right. You're quite right. I'll again, conscious, we've got about 4 minutes. So questions come in, which I quite think is quite nice. It's quite a nice one to sort of round us up on. How do you see the role of celebrity/public figures in campaigning for specific issues in the next few months? Celebs involved in politics, mixed bag generally. And I'm sure all the parties will be sort of wheeling out the celebs for their election campaign. So any thoughts on, and actually, if you want to name a name of a celeb that you would be your favourite celeb for a political party, that might be quite nice as well. But anyway, let's go on. Who wants to take that first?
You've seen it very, if you look at some of the work that folks like Fermor have done on environmental issues, on water, on so they cut through incredibly effectively. I mean, he's actually a politician, but Farage is also celebrity too. I mean, he's just been in the jungle, a different kind of jungle to the political jungle, but and he cuts through as much as celebrity as anything else. And actually, the change in the, you were talking earlier, Stuart, about the change in the or what we have to watch out for, which is sort of deep fake activity, but the change in our media landscape. I think it's going to be really. And remember, there are very specific broadcast Ofcom rules for elections. Our broadcasting landscape has changed quite a lot since the last election, and it's just going to be very, very interesting to see how that is navigated as well. But yeah, I mean, for time immemorial, all parties have loved celebrity endorsement, and I don't think this coming year is going to be any different.
Thanks, Iain. Emily, do you want to take next? And we can. I know I've sort of slightly cut across Iain there, but any final thoughts in these comments as well? Iain, I'll come back to you in case you've got any final thoughts. Sorry, I didn't ask you that just now.
Yeah, of course, on celebrity or just generally?
Generally, celebrities, yeah. But if you want to just any other little final thoughts just as we come towards the end, that would be fab.
Yeah, cool. So I guess on celebrities, I think Iain touched on an interesting point that we've seen in the last few years in politics is the rise of the political celebrity. So I think Nadine Dorries was one of the first, and even Penny Mordaunt to go on a kind of celebrity game show. And I think we're going to see that happening even more, particularly with the number of Conservative MPs who are likely to be looking for jobs in later on in the year. So I think that's something to watch out for, to kind of limited effect. And then to summarise, I think I would reiterate my point around the importance of the kind of third parties, given that's been a kind of big part of my role on this panel. I think absolutely a Labour majority is looking the most likely. There's a lot you can still achieve though in the next 6 months if you have urgent priorities, and don't forget about the third parties because they could be very crucial in a few months' time.
Brilliant, thank you. Tara, do you want to celebs and final thoughts?
I'm going to cheat and I'm going to say I think that Matthew McConaughey is going to be the governor of Texas. You can just feel he's putting out all the feelers. He's doing lots of podcasts, and wow, I wish we had someone that exciting to be a celebrity guest for the UK. I just keep thinking of the cheeky girls with Lempit Opik. I think that's the highest celebrity we've ever achieved, really.
Who can't resist a mention of the cheeky girls and them, Christine.
Absolutely. Look, I think on the celebs point, I think one of the advantages that parties on the left tend to have is, you know, because the vote skews younger, you tend to get slightly cooler celebs. So I think at one point the Tories had like Michael Caine and Gary Barlow, and as you say, the Lib Dems had the cheeky girls, whereas, you know, Labour has had, you know, the Martin Freemans and David Tennants back when he was Doctor Who. We'll see a lot of that. I would be surprised if Labour in particular wasn't looking at celebrities that are going to really engage that kind of key demographic in the 30s and 40s. So those people who are actually most likely to switch from Labour to Conservative, who are going to be absolutely critical. Just in terms of kind of prepping for this year, I know we've talked a lot about the kind of the high politics of it, but remembering to keep engagement with civil servants who are frankly going to keep the whole show on the road for the next year. It's actually a really good time to build and cement those relationships in the civil service. And the biggest piece of advice, and I give it to myself as well as to everyone else, is it's really important that we get out of the bubble. I think all of us are living and breathing this election all of the time at the moment, but remembering how little of this actually cuts through to the general public is important. So, you know, go and talk to your mums and your dads and your friends, and, you know, look at media outside that political bubble, because I think we're starting to see some issues really cutting through, but it can really, really impact the strategy once you get a sense of kind of what matters in Westminster and then what's really going to matter in the country.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, look, I'm always slightly concerned when they start wheeling out celebrities what I've never heard of, because I'm the wrong demographic. And Iain, I'll come back to you just at the end there. Sorry, because I didn't ask you for any final thoughts. So I'll let you come up with anything else that you want to just raise at the end there.
Well, just almost in a way, picking up from Christine's point, perhaps the most effective campaign that we've seen in a generation is what we've just witnessed on our television screens about the post office. It does show with a particular laser focus and a particular national attention, and I think we've touched on some of this today, then there can be real and sudden impact. So watch out for maybe more of that this year too.
Brilliant, thank you. Emily's just had to drop off, unfortunately, because I've not quite kept us to time. But it just remains for me to say thank you to you all for joining us today on this session, but particularly, obviously, thank you to the panel for their insight, but also to thank Polymonitor, who have kindly supported the webinar today as well. You can relive the whole experience on YouTube at some point in the future, should you so wish. But Emily, Christine, Iain, Tara, thank you for your time, hugely appreciated, and I know that I've got a lot from it, so I'm hoping the audience have as well. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.